I am here. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. So, very good. So, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the NOAA's Virtual Lab Forum, our first edition for 2018. We have some new attendees, so I'll remind everyone that the VLab Forum is provided as a place to gain exposure for new ideas, concepts, etc., technologies and science that may be making their way to National Weather Service operation. We provide the forum on a monthly basis, and our format is basically 30 minutes of content followed by approximately 30 minutes of question and answer. And so we ask that you reserve your questions to the question and answer period unless it's something of urgent clarification. During the Q&A portion, we ask that you use the raise your hand feature, and the VLab production manager, John Chattel, will unmute you so that you can ask your question to the speaker directly. You can also choose to provide a question through the chat function of the GoToWebinar if you'd like, and in that case, John Chattel will read your question on your behalf in that manner. Also to remind that these webinars are recorded for posterity, and this one will be uploaded to the VLab Forum website shortly after the conclusion of the session. So without further ado, we're very privileged to have Dr. Jennifer Henderson, I believe of University of Colorado. Is that the correct affiliation, Jennifer?
That's correct.
Okay. I have seen Jennifer provide versions of this talk, first at the National Weather Association annual meeting in last September, and then last week as well at the AMS annual meeting. It's pertaining directly to Weather Service's new bold mission of impact-based decision support services. And I think it's got a lot of, stretch kind of ideas here that we're really very happy that Jennifer and her colleagues have delved into. And I think you're going to find this very stimulating. So without further ado, hand over the presentation to you, Jennifer.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here today. One caveat, I don't know how many of you are at AMS, but I have some sort of plague, mostly vocal. I feel fine, but so I apologize if I cough or anything in between the presentation. And thank you so much for letting me talk about my research here, acknowledging the collaborators that you've already mentioned, Steve, Julie DeMuth, Heather Lazarus, Rebecca Morse, and Jamie Vickery. They're working on, they're sort of collaborating with me on this particular piece, but more importantly, they're sort of taking on a complementary piece of this work where they're looking at the public side of this issue, not necessarily in terms of time in the same way, but looking at some of the same consequences of sort of how we message the public. So I'll be talking a little bit today about time. And I want to just say at the outset, and Steve probably heard me say this, it is a bit of a stretch conversation. It's I was calling it provocative because I mean it to be a conversation starter. And I'm thinking about time in different ways that maybe this community hasn't had a chance to interact with yet. The main takeaway for today is that time is often taken for granted in how we assume time operates for everyone and the different kinds of time that are available to us to talk about. So I'll just briefly outline what I'm going to say today just so that you have a sense of where I'm going. Speaking of time, outlining. So dynamics of time and theories of time, I'll start there, just kind of a brief primer and overview. And then I'll be talking about two main kinds of time. One that you're probably all familiar with, which is chronological time. And I'll give some examples from a case study from the Vortex Southeast project that we're working on. And then I'm going to introduce a new way of thinking about time, which is karyological time. And it's time, a way of thinking about time that's discussed in a lot of the social sciences and humanities literature, but hasn't really made its way as much into meteorology, though, as you might imagine, in physics and quantum physics, time is constantly being reinvented and re-understood. So it's not necessarily novel in that sense. And then I'll move on to next steps. So just a little bit about the motivation and the background for this kind of work and why time is so important. And I'll start by giving you some information that you're probably very familiar with. Information about threats changes as certainty and uncertainty about upcoming events evolved. So as we move from a few days out to the day before to the day of, the different modalities, languages, and visualization and representations of that information are dynamic as well. So they're changing and evolving in time. Part of this reason is the weather itself is changing, but also not all types of information are understood and resonate with all people. So we have different communities and audiences we're speaking to as well. The next piece is vulnerabilities, which are layered and complex. They're emergent, so they're not static over time. People become vulnerable in ways that they weren't before. And vulnerability isn't just about the characteristics of the people, but also different dimensions of experience that we have. So, for instance, where we are in our day relative to time and place, our location, our movement. Not everyone has the exact same patterns every day. If you're on vacation or if you're on a weekend versus a weekday, they can vary. The same is true of demographics and ability. Those change as we age, they change as we have children, they change as we move through life with different abilities. So these are more of the kind of the traditional ways of thinking about vulnerability. But then there's also familiarity and access that change and evolve over time. So people going off to school in new locations, people on holiday or traveling for business, and also kind of the access that people have in their day-to-day lives. Can vary whether they're in their home and what kind of structure they live in, whether they're in a school and what kind of structure that is. So we also know that these are evolving and not the same every day for people. And then finally, the storms themselves, multiple types of weather, different modes of weather, different seasonalities, diurnal and nocturnal types of events, and the types of threat and the overlapping and multiplicity of events. In some of my work, I look at overlapping tornado and flash flood warnings with the Weather Service. And this became really important at the AMS conference when people were talking about overlapping hurricane and tornado, storm surge, flash flood, and tornado warnings. So there's a lot of things going on with the dynamics of the weather itself. But in each of these cases, there is one aspect that sort of doesn't get addressed, and that is time itself. But we know that time, and the way that we often talk about time in weather prediction is very important. One of the ways we talk about time is timeliness. So we think about prediction and detection of threats, the communication within and between offices, and of course to the public, information dissemination, feedback from people, support services and DSS for partners, and then also different actions by different people. So if you notice here, time is already starting to kind of fracture into different kinds of time. It's like kind of linear time when we're thinking about time scales, timelines, chronology, but we're also thinking about humans and human timelines and human interactions, which is sort of the tension I want to highlight today. So in the social sciences and humanities, there are multiple different theories of time. They come from psychology, from sociology, they come from history and philosophy. And so here you see the perception of time is one kind of way of framing how we think about and theorize time. Perceptions can be about individual orientations. There's a psychologist who's working on thinking about past, present, and future orientations. Like, are you more of a past thinker, and are you oriented towards the past? Are you oriented towards the future thinking, and how entire cultures can function this way? Time that's deployed through values placed on chronology or duration or pace of life. These vary in cultures. Some paces of life are much slower or much more easygoing. We have different ways of categorizing, characterizing cultures and places based on time. It's also about how we coordinate activities and also the value economically that we put on time and how that gets measured in our workday, how many hours we log, how much we're paid per hour, those sorts of things. And then there's also expressions of time, which there's less work. There's starting to be more work on this. Notions of expectation, anticipation, and surprise, especially when it comes to weather hazards where people are saying they were caught off guard or they were surprised by something happening, which was said a lot around here in Boulder during the 2013 floods. So some colleagues of mine, Lisa Dilling and Rebecca Morse and others are looking at the notion of surprise. Not necessarily framed as a perception of time, but looking at how that affects the way that we think about and behave in the context of severe weather. And I just want to show you some images. These are just pulled from the internet to show you how pervasive these notions of time are that are not necessarily chronological. You know, thinking of family time, how time is money, running out of time, time disappearing, trying to hold back time or stop time, even this sort of interesting swirly time that's more of like a psychological or kind of emotional time. And then, of course, in the United States, we think of time zones, and we're very aware right now we're in, you know, we're waiting for the time to change again, so we gain back that hour in the mornings or in the evenings. At least I am. So we think about time as kind of a very organizing principle for how we behave, how we think about our experiences, and how we organize our lives. So today I want to talk about how time is deployed through values of chronology, duration, pace of life, and coordination of activities. And a little bit on the economics, but not much here. Let's see, I'm talking about coordination of activities and dispersing of information. And primarily what we're going to be looking at first is chronological time. And it's defined here as a quantitative concept of time, an account of what happened during a particular period, or as one scholar called it, clock time. And I'd like to demonstrate a primary concept of time that I see functioning kind of as a variation on chronological time, which is coordination activities, which makes sense if you're in a forecast office and you're trying to think about, okay, when does information come out and come to me, and how does that information get disseminated? And primarily, the kind of time that I'm talking about in the weather context for chronology is often dictated by technologies. When we get updates, when we get information from satellites and radar, waiting for that 5-minute radar scan before we update a warning, different model runs coming in, and when those model runs come in, how those affect when we send out information or how we assess that information and diagnose the atmosphere. And then also that then trickles down to thinking about how the weather is unfolding itself, but also how our products are organized by chronology. So when I do my work with the forecast office, of course, there are certain products that go out at certain times, different shifts work on different products. This can vary from office to office, but it's very time oriented and it's very chronological oriented. So I think this is kind of the dominant frame of time that we have in operation, and what we think about when we think about time in the forecast office. And I'd say in the enterprise more generally as well. So let me just pause here and just talk a little bit about the methods before I move on to the example, so you know the kind of context for the case that I'm going to bring up. And the first thing I'd like to say, and this is sort of a standard for me kind of way of talking about what social science does and how social science behaves, at least qualitatively. I do case studies. Other people do work that's more generalizable, quantitative work. Sample sizes are much larger. But there's a real inherent value in case studies that I think will resonate with the meteorological community, which is, and this is a quote by David Schultz from the Finnish Meteorological Institute on the value of cases and how to do them well. They're indispensable to meteorology. By describing how the weather evolved during a particular event, case studies can be integral to improving weather forecasts. They can reveal mesoscale phenomena that were previously undiscovered. This is very similar and analogous to how cases work in the social sciences. By examining particular instances of different people and organizations and technologies working together around a certain event, particular kinds of issues or concerns or insights emerge. And this is the case that happened for me in looking at this case and thinking about time. So the case that I want to focus on today was January 22nd, 2017, last winter, in Albany and Adel, Georgia. And it was is part of Project Vortex, as I mentioned. So we were trying to look at how vulnerability and the dynamics of information evolve and how that information evolving affects people's vulnerability and vice versa. So we picked this event because it had a lot of features that were really interesting and in some ways tragic for us to examine. So you see here on this slide that there was an EF3 that killed 11 people at 3:45 in the morning. So these were people who were in manufactured and mobile homes. They were in a very rural area of Georgia and didn't have a centralized shelter. So you can imagine sort of the tragedy unfolding there. Later that next afternoon, an EF3 again killed 5 people, and it tracked 71 miles. It was very wide, very quick moving storms. It was the deadliest outbreak in this area for 17 years. There were 3 rounds of weather, which made it really unusually difficult in terms of forecasting and messaging. So if you count the marginal risk on Thursday, there were actually 4 rounds, and Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, each one increased in terms of severity from the SPC, with the outlooks from enhanced to high risk on Sunday. It was the first high risk in the US since 2014, and only the second time that this forecast office had used tornado emergency, and that was with the Adele tornado in the early mornings, the January 22nd. So you can see a map here of sort of the tornado tracks. This was part of a larger system. There were multiple tornadoes touching down, but we're just focusing on sort of the events around these 2, and I'm looking at it from a forecaster's standpoint. So I conducted 16 interviews with the National Weather Service, an emergency manager, and a couple of broadcast media from the area, and then looked at the Facebook feeds and some of the Twitter feeds for the National Weather Service and broadcasters. And I'll mention that here, when I was doing these interviews with the National Weather Service, is when my colleagues Julie and Heather were out interviewing people in the public who were affected by these storms. So we have, some of our next steps are to coordinate this information. And also just a little background into how social science works. Interviewing people means we audio record them, we transcribe them, and then we put them in software that allows us to code for important themes that emerge, and this is how time emerged. So here you see a screenshot of Deduce software, and on my right side, you can see the codes that are sort of emerging there and how I'm highlighting the text to look at those codes. So this is just a way of helping people who aren't familiar on the call with qualitative data and how it works and how it's analyzed. So some of the preliminary results I want to talk to you about include this notion of chronological time as an expression of kind of coordination, how we coordinate events based on chronology. And so I've been thinking through what are the kind of ways that we might categorize time. And one way to categorize time is logistical time, which I'm defining as the organization of complex operations. So how do logistics work? And interestingly, in this particular data set, it became clear that the SPC outlooks for coordinating a lot of the local practices in the forecast office. So here you see a quote. I set it up years ago where if there's a lower end threat, like marginal, you email a briefing packet to your partners. If it's a significant event, like a moderate, you do a webinar. And in this office, in fact, webinars are often triggered by moderate events, moderate outlooks. So that's the primary purpose, is sort of coordinating activities between the SPC, the National Weather Service, and the emergency managers and partners they work with. I'm wondering how this might factor into notions of consistency as well, that you're having a consistent message and consistent time. So a secondary aspect of this is that when the emergency management and partners get their webinar invite, they're supposed to know that we mean business, because it's not very often. It's only triggered by moderate risk. So, and ultimately they did end up doing a briefing before the event, before the moderate risk, or just as the moderate risk was coming out. So another way that this logistical time is being used is not only to organize the complex operations, but it's also being used to convey severity. So these emails and these mechanisms are meant to trigger a sense of risk awareness for this office. And this is just a graphic that I created that sort of highlights on kind of a broad scale the timeline of events so that you can see this coordination of activities happening. And you can see how the slight risk, the marginal, slight, enhanced, moderate, and then the high sort of coordinate with the information that the National Weather Service is sending out. In fact, on day 6, there's mention of slight risk with the SPC, and that actually gets brought up in the AFDs. So the National Weather Service is already talking about this event nearly a week out. And you can see the progression and overlap of different kinds of activities that are happening between the National Weather Service and the emergency management, including at the bottom there, the request for a webinar. The emergency managers are requesting webinars far sooner than what the protocols and the logistics of the office would suggest, which is a moderate risk. But the EMs are asking for that information sooner. And so one of the things that then becomes problematic about organizing sort of these these groups of people, the National Weather Service, the SPC, and the emergency management, by logistical times, that it has assumptions embedded in it that become problematic for some of the groups. So the SPC time actually cascades into the EM's timeline, and it's not convenient for the EMs to be on this kind of time frame where they get a webinar with a moderate outlook. In fact, one forecaster said, if we're going into a weekend and the EMs are going to get information at 3 p.m., then it's too late, or a little late, because the EMs are out the door, off the phones for the weekend. So we learned that lead time is important, especially if we're going to do a webinar with a potential significant event. So it was eye-opening for this office to see all the pieces that the emergency managers need to have fall in place on their end heading into a weekend. So weekends and a different kind of time becomes important here, weekday versus weekends. So the partners then are learning the needs of the emergency managers and are thinking about reshaping kind of their logistical information, which is, I think, a form of IDSS, and an important form of IDSS that helps challenge some of the assumptions behind chronology. And so here's just a graphic, sort of just returning to this again. The webinar is starting to be requested much earlier in early parts of the day on Thursday. The webinar goes out on Friday, but it's not quite in concert with the moderate risk. So the emergency manager needs are sort of shifting the protocols of the forecast office. Another way of thinking about coordinating of time beyond logistics and how activities kind of line up, and when people get information, how that allows them to coordinate information or activities, is communication time, which is visual and textual messages that are actually going out, so the content. Here is the graphic that was sent to me by one of the broadcasters I interviewed, and you can see clearly the red is the warning, the tornado warning for Adele. It's 45-minute lead time. It's produced tornadoes before this, and so this storm is very dangerous. There's already a severe thunderstorm watch or warning out on it. But you can see the kind of faded pinkish brown. That's the watch, the tornado watch, which at the time did not extend into the area where Adele was affected. And so there's kind of lost opportunity here to communicate risk to this this particular community at night there, and this comes up actually in the interviews with the broadcaster. He's explaining to me this graphic, and he says it's 2:55 a.m. and there's still not a watch for Adele. Now Adele, the tornado happens at 3:45 a.m. Thomas County's under a watch, but if you go one county over, there's not a watch, 3:18 a.m. So right after the warning went out, the Storm Prediction Center or the Weather Service said, all right, all the way from Dothan, Alabama, down to Tallahassee to Savannah, you guys are under a watch. But another forecaster brings up that this is a problem. The lack of the watch concerned me because some people don't take it as seriously if they're not under a watch, because why would you? If you're not under a watch, you don't have to watch out for the conditions. So this is a kind of time frame issue between when SPC products are coming out and when they're going out to the public. I'm not privy to the SPC's timeline. I'm not entirely certain how that coordinates and lines up with what the National Weather Service Forecast Office, the local office, is doing. I wasn't there at the time, but this is one area where I think we could use more understanding, is the coordination and communication between the national and local office, because so far we've seen the SPC is actually shaping the public message that's going out about this particular threat as well. And in particular, the communication or lack thereof in this particular instance is potentially contributing to vulnerability for this community. We don't know for sure, but it's a possibility. So another instance of this kind of communication time that I want to talk about is about trust and preparation, and how the way that we coordinate our time in terms of communication can lead to building trust and also preparation on the part of the public. This is an office that did a fantastic job throughout the week, posting on Facebook and engaging with the public and answering questions. As per National Weather Service protocol, however, when the high risk warning went out, or the high risk outlook went out rather, and they posted that on Facebook, they gave this message that you see here, that it's rare to get a high risk. It's only happened a handful of times, so there's this like heightened awareness. Don't be caught off guard or lulled between storms. We have multiple ways of getting warnings. And then they note that they don't post warnings on Facebook, and we know that's because of timestamp issues. So they moved to Twitter. But you see sort of a number of people ask that they continue to do this on Facebook, And for you and I, we might say, well, it's just another platform. You can easily go over to Twitter. You don't have to have an account. You can just watch the warnings there. But one of the things that I also saw happen on this webpage, which was really interesting, is how people would tag each other to let other people know that something was happening in their area. So they were notifying each other to pay attention. They were also having conversations about, you know, do you need to take shelter at our house? Do you need to come over here? So they had a network that was well established on Facebook that they may not have had on Twitter. So moving to Twitter is not just simply a platform change. I've got this parenthetical here that it's potentially a loss of social capital, which is something that people need to build in order to mitigate vulnerability. So thinking about how we time the changes between platforms and taking into account that it may not just be about, you know, one platform over another, but the way people are using it, how they're building networks and community online as well. And then here I'll give one more example of the communication time, which I'm showing with this sort of gap here in the timeline. This is the same timeline but reproduced with the broadcasters inserted here and the National Weather Service instead of the emergency managers. So what you see here is that there's not a lot of information that's happening between the National Weather Service and the broadcasters until the warnings start going out. But there's a lot of activity between the broadcasters and the SPC that is happening. And these broadcasters also, again, commendable efforts. At one point, one of the broadcasters knows that all of the community has kind of lost power as storms have gone through, so people don't have access to cable. So she's got her phone held up to her her TV or her computer camera, and she's showing people on Facebook Live her radar and talking them through it. So just really heroic efforts all around with this event with the National Weather Service, emergency management, and broadcasters. But an interesting gap here that doesn't exist, it's a gap of communication that exists between the broadcasters and the National Weather Service, is framed interestingly by the broadcasters. They say, we don't need to contact the National Weather Service when I asked if they have, you know, conversations or if they're part of the IDSS. We have the SPC to issue outlooks and we use those. But of course, we do forward warnings from the National Weather Service and information, but largely we're doing our own meteorology and assessing the situation of our viewers. So there's a loss of a potential partnership here because maybe there's just an understanding that it's really just about doing their own meteorology and not needing to coordinate because the SPC is enough of a coordination effort for them. They're also sort of highlighting here that they are paying attention to their viewers and responding much more to the situation of their viewers with their meteorology than perhaps the National Weather Service does. So there's a real opportunity, I think, here to kind of bridge this partnership and build a relationship. But the question, of course, is always, when do you do this? When is the opportune time to have that communication and that relationship built in terms of chronology? So those are some of the, I think, issues that arose and assumptions that are being made based on sort of a chronological overview of time. I'd like to introduce karyological time, which I think is very unfamiliar in this community. As I mentioned, it's a qualitative concept of time, and it translates into something like the opportune time to do something or the right time to act. It's much more complicated than that, but it's a way of thinking not just of the clock time, but of the people time, of the human time. It's local, it's situated, and it's based on sort of the communicator and the audience knowing each other well. So I think this might also contribute to notions of IDSS. But here, I found this in my search for definitions of kairos, which is it's a Greek phrase. There's chronos and kairos, and chronos becomes chronology and kairos becomes karyological time. It's the perfect, delicate, crucial moment, the fleeting greatness of time and place that creates the opportune atmosphere for action, words, and movement. And this is also weather. I don't know what that refers to exactly. I had read several definitions. This is the first one I saw that introduced the notion of weather, but an appropriate graphic nonetheless that explains kairos. From some of the literature, kairos is all about finding the opportune time to engage another. As the saying goes, timing is everything. Another way to think about kairos that adds to this is what is said or done must conform to both audience and occasion. So that notion of situatedness rather than clock, dictating timing that the audience and the occasion are dictating the timing, and that you have to have an understanding of both in order to sort of successfully, in this case, persuade someone of something. It comes from rhetoric. And a little bit more complication here, taking advantage of the timeliness and appropriateness of the situation. The term also implies being knowledgeable of and involved in the environment where the situation is taking place in order to benefit from truly seizing the opportune moment. So there's many things happening here. There's the context of the situation, you know, the threat, in this case, the impending storms that are occurring and the multiplicity of storms that are occurring. There's the context of the people who are involved in potentially in harm's way, which are multiple, as we know, and complex in their own right. And then there's also just kind of the knowledge of all of those situations on the part of the communicator or the person who's doing the persuading or has the message to impart to the audience. And those things have to come together at a kind of a timeliness and appropriateness that's based on the receiver, the audience, not necessarily on the messenger. So having to know when is it timely and appropriate for somebody to have that information is part of, I think, what the weather community is looking at. And just some graphics that I think get to more of kind of the notion of karyological time. And there's overlap in these images, of course, with chronological time. But just this sense that it's perceptual, it's experiential, it's unique and individual, and it's also based in relationships and knowing the right context, the right timing, and the right situation to have those conversations. And just as an example from this case that I'd like to highlight is one of the more tragic elements of our work as a weather community is trying to figure out how to help those who are most vulnerable. And I was talking to one of the management staff and asking this person, so what could these people have done? Like, what can we do in the future? And this person said, I can't think of anything people can do in a mobile home at 3 in a rural area. There's no safe place. Now, this is, of course, barring the fact that maybe there were a public shelter, but there's not. You've got to have some system where the people in the mobile home parks will be able to get out in time and get to a neighbor that has more significant structure to get to a family. And this struck me as a really interesting example of karyological time, because here, the safe place is an expression of a situated opportunity. When is it most opportune for these communities to think about getting out? Certainly the warning is not the most opportune time. The watch might have been the most opportune time, though there wasn't a watch. And again, this isn't blame, this is just simply describing that there was a situation in which there wasn't a watch. But thinking about how those pieces of information on the chronological scale affect people in kind of the karyological scale, how that affects their ability to act on opportune moments. So my next steps with my colleagues is to think about how karyological time might be used in the framework of vulnerability. And this is a graphic that explains one version of kind of how the progression of vulnerability works. You see here root causes, dynamic pressures, unsafe conditions, and then this notion of how risk and hazard and vulnerability are coming together with those hazards. I think that what's missing potentially in even the social sciences conversation is karyological time, or something that talks about time and how people experience it. So that's sort of where I'm heading. I just want to thank you so much for the time. I'm excited to hear your questions. These are some of the references from the literature that I've included here. And I just want to acknowledge also that the 2 Vortex grants that help fund this are listed there at the bottom from NOAA. So thank you so much. I look forward to your questions.
And thank you so much, Jennifer, for that very thought-provoking talk and exposure to these very different ideas, I would say, for our meteorological community. So at this point, we're going to go to question and answer. So if you have a question, please use the raise your hand feature, and we will unmute you so you can ask your question directly to Jennifer or use the chat. I'd like to use the host prerogative to start off, Jennifer, with a follow-up question. So it seems like the karyological time is really the essence of IDSS time, if you will, because it's focused on the opportune moment in which to get the best decisions to be made. In the case of our Weather Service Corps partners, these decisions presumably affect a large percentage of the population, or they're decisions made which affect others. So that seems to be the most important time. So part of your message here, I think, to National Weather Service is that we need to sort of get out of our usual chronological procedural time, or at least start to explore this idea of karyological time or IDSS time more if we want to provide better IDSS services, because that's really where people are acting and making decisions. So in particular, the discussion that I've heard over many, many years with regard to tornado warnings, since your case is involving tornadoes, is the question of lead time. So, you often hear, well, it's not the simple thing to just increasing tornado lead time, tornado warning lead time. It's not necessarily a good thing. There's evidence that if you provide a warning too soon, that people will go outside and see that the sky is, clear, and then go back to do their normal things. So too much lead time is not necessarily good. It's not karyological because it doesn't get the desired response. So in other words, it focuses on what you're presenting here. So I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so that's a really great question. So the first part of what I hear you saying is I'm trying to connect karyological time to IDSS, and I think that's sort of where I'm heading, is that some of the ways, at least that I understand IDSS, and I understand that it's also evolving itself, who's a partner, what's a deep core partner, what are the kinds of activities that can be done, and how to prioritize who can have most of the attention with IDSS given the limitations of staff. And I understand it's very complex, but yes, I think that's one of the things I hear commonly between sort of this notion of karyological time and IDSS is that we all live within these kind of superstructures of our lives, our office, our jobs, the work processes, deadlines. These are all chronological, and they're not going to go away. That's not to say we have to dismiss chronology. But I think in terms of the National Weather Service, there is, in many ways, like there are zone forecasts that are legacy products. I think that there are timing issues that are legacy timings. They have been in play. How it responds with how different products are correlated with the incoming information, how they go out at certain time scales. I'm not certain about all of those rationales, but it might be worth looking at, are those the best times given the new focus on IDSS, and thinking about the situatedness of our partners and their needs. So time might need to be something that gets included in considerations of IDSS. And I think it's starting to be included in subtle ways, but maybe not overt ways. So that's sort of the first part of what I heard you say. In terms of tornado warnings and lead time, I don't have a real concrete sort of solution kind of answer, but I do have a thought about this, which it's something I've been toying with for a while, which is I think when we say warning, it depends on the context in which we're talking about a warning, what we mean by that. So let me explain. When we say, okay, well, people getting a warning, that's a polygon that's attached to a time frame that dictates when the threat was detected or suspected and when the event occurs given a certain community. And lead time then becomes kind of a mathematical equation about averaging out, the time of the polygon, the time of the event, the reports, all of that stuff. So there's that kind of logistics happening with the warning. But when I'm around forecasters in the forecast office, and people in the public say, like, I didn't know there was a storm coming, I didn't get the warning, I will sometimes hear forecasters say, well, they've had 3 or 4 days of warning. Because in the forecaster's construct, they're including outlooks and the news reports and the actual polygon itself. So there's a much broader time frame from which we actually think people are starting to get warned. So I think if I think beyond simply like lead time and warning for polygons or the more micro scale kind of warning that we're thinking about, and I go to the macro scale warning that I hear forecasters think about, that to me seems more ripe for karyological time, because it's thinking about how to message for multiple days across multiple modalities and in multiple ways, which we know is the best way to reach people and prepare them to get that polygon. So I don't know the particulars of what's the best mechanism in terms of increasing the polygon lead time or that like short-term lead time. I do know that in that short term, we might think people aren't taking actions. We might think they're ignoring a warning, but some of the preliminary work that Julie and Heather have done with these public interviews suggests that the warnings from other storms or even the warning for the tornadoes were sending people to find more information, turning on the TV, checking their NOAA radio, making phone calls. So it wasn't as kind of, you know, the warning itself and the lead time wasn't necessarily having people have too much time and what they're doing with that time. People in the time that they did have were actually looking for confirmation. They were looking for more additional information to make their decisions. So that's a lot to unpack. I hope I somewhere in there sort of addressed a couple of your questions.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. It was a long-winded question, and it deserved, you know, a long-winded response. We've got a question from Dr. Steve Koch, Director of NSSL. Steve, go ahead and ask your question.
Steve, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you, Steve.
Okay, Jennifer, hi. This is, yeah, I'm at NSSL, and also I think Jennifer knows I'm the program manager for Vortex Southeast.
Yes.
So I'm kind of going to give you kind of a loaded question. I don't expect you're going to have the answer, because I'm not sure that there is one answer to the question. But
sure.
It kind of falls on to the question you just responded to. We are very concerned in the Southeast with you know, the amount of injuries and death per capita that are occurring, and there are many factors that we've been able to isolate that contribute to that. Certainly, perception of risk and communication of risk are important. Lead time is an issue. But this question about as you define karyological time, by the way, I've never heard that term before, I love it, is really a very personal thing. And one of the discussions we've had is that one person's opportune time, as you defined it, opportune to be, it's going to be different from another person. And it's not just a question of one person's understanding or perception of risk being different than another person's, but it also has to do with their responsibilities and the decision-making process. So by way of example, a person who's responsible for thousands of people's lives, like a sports arena operator or a medical facility hospital manager, right? Would have very different karyological time to meet their needs than an individual might have. So here's my question. Given that we are achieving technically and scientifically the capability to extend tornado warning lead times beyond the nominal 13 or 14 minutes, to 20 minutes and beyond using rapidly scanning radar, and even beyond that using numerical weather prediction ensemble systems, project called Warning Forecast, then how do we communicate that to subgroups of society, given that they have these different karyological time frames? I mean, is one message coming out from the person issuing the warning sufficient, or do we have to kind of put out multiple kinds of warnings or phrase it in different ways so that different groups will react in the way that optimizes the response to what they hear?
Yeah, and Steve, so I don't know if you'll remember, we had a conversation about philosophy of science at Vortex Southeast, and some of this literature comes out of that tradition. So I think that, to your question, the Weather Service is already to some degree considering that sort of more I don't want to say tailored. It's not tailored in the way that you would compete with private industry, but tailored in the fact that you recognize a multiplicity of different audiences. So, and customer bases. So for example, the Weather Service is starting to think about the languages with which it needs to translate its warnings, acknowledging that no one size fits all languages. So I see some of this already happening, and I think it's the right direction to go in terms of thinking about like larger groups of people and how you can make sure that information gets to those groups in an understandable and actionable way. In terms of like individuals on the ground and how many millions of us there are, and can you tailor to all of them? No, but I do think your point is a good one in terms of if I were to think with an IDSS hat on, or you know, thinking about the relationships with partners, that's where I think the opportunity really is to have a big impact in terms of thinking, well, if I'm responsible as a principal or I'm responsible as an emergency manager for a large group of resources going out that are going to help people, or a large group of people themselves, knowing sort of when their opportune times are is important. I think that's embedded in IDSS in many ways, but maybe not framed as directly as understanding. We think of it as needs and thresholds, but thinking about when is their opportune time is important. So I do think that that's a level that the Weather Service can do. And in terms of like individualized and public messaging for, you know, multiple groups that are getting their information through No Weather Radio or the website or through their phones, I don't have the clear answer to that, of course. I think that allowing the people on the ground to sort of set some of the parameters for when they get information and the kind of information they want is already in the works within the Weather Service, and I think that's a good model to allow people to sort of have input into when they're when they want the information, the kind of information, and the thresholds of information that they want. So that's a step in that kind of direction where at least they are able to think from their perspective what meets their needs. So if that makes sense. So sort of on a couple of different scales. At the mid-level scale with partners, I think there's a direct way to sort of implement something like karyological time as a way of thinking. On an individual level with the public, I think it might be more like allowing people to tailor or make some sort of inputs into their own decisions. But that's not going to work for everybody, of course, which is why we need our partners, broadcast media, because they'll have different kinds of ways of reaching individuals in terms of timing. So, yes, loaded, and I don't have a good answer, but I don't.
Okay. Does that get to your question, Steve?
Yeah, it's a really loaded question, of course, and it's very complex, as Jeffrey mentioned. Thanks for your response.
Yes, thank you, Jeffrey. We got this is a comment, I believe, from John Zeitler. I'll just read it. It's through the chat. This is to you, Jennifer. Your concept of karyological time will become increasingly important in the WARN-ON forecast or facets framework, giving people ever-changing and initially small probabilities of an event occurring will be of little help. The key is having a person define what action is to be taken. For example, moving residents of a nursing home to a safe room, then finding the lead time to accomplish that. That then defines the karyological time for which the information must arrive to the decision maker. This can be tested, simulated, and drilled. While there are many time needs, we should deep core part. Uh-oh, we're gonna mute. Hang on.
Okay.
A little bit of echo there.
Yeah, that's okay.
All right. Wow. Okay, I'm just gonna plow through. We have another question from. Please use the raise your hand.
So I'm sorry. Was there a question embedded in that, or that was just the comment?
That was just a comment.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, so I just wanted to say, I think it's an interesting idea to think about how, you know, groups like hospitals, the kinds of actions and like scenario planning that they would do, that you could then backwards engineer lead time for, which is very different from how we approach lead time now, which is thinking about what amount of time are we able to give people, and then what amount of time ought we give people, which isn't necessarily connected to how people are actually living their lives. So I think that comment gets to making the lead time more meaningful, which I would say, yes, I agree with that. And thank you for the comment.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Jennifer.
Okay, Jennifer.
Sorry about the audio problems. Can we go back to your next step slide, Jennifer? I have a question about that.
Absolutely. Let me get to that computer. There. Yes.
Okay, could you elaborate a bit more on the intent of this slide? Because I must admit I'm not quite clear on it, and it seems like an important slide. We have the time.
Yeah, no, that's a great idea. So one of the motivations for me, let me just back up a little bit and say one of the motivations for me and my colleagues with the Vortex Southeast is to think about the ways that vulnerability is dynamic. How does vulnerability change across time, and how is that coupled with changing kinds and dynamics of information and weather? So you've got all these moving parts. This slide here represents sort of one of the main theories of how vulnerability works. So if you look, not the clock and the sort of arrow on the karyological, but just the graphic itself that starts with root causes. This is one of the ways, and there are multiple ways, that people in hazards community are trying to visualize how vulnerability works. So you have things like the root causes, power structures, so power structures and resources, so the kind of physical things that people need in order to not be vulnerable. Then there's all these ideological things like cultural systems. For example, one of my colleagues, Kevin Ash, does work in the Southeast, and he has found that in a lot of South Carolina communities, when they are preparing for tornadoes, that the family actually gathers in the center of the mobile home, and the father makes decisions about what they're going to do next. That's a very cultural kind of way of thinking about how to act in light of a tornado threat. That's very different from a different kind of culture where in the African American community you might have men making decisions, or you might have different ways of thinking about what risk means. You might have spiritual ways of thinking about what risk means. So all of those are kind of underlying the root causes. And then you have these dynamic pressures in the middle that are affecting the root causes or amplifying them or attenuating them. And then you also have these unsafe conditions where people are kind of their social relationships and ability to engage with others, their knowledge about disaster preparedness, those sorts of things. These three things are all coming together and kind of existing prior to the hazard. They underscore the hazard. And so when you get the hazard itself happening, it magnifies this vulnerability. So this is one way of visualizing vulnerability. And what I'm suggesting is that when I look at this graphic and I look at all the things that come into play, one of the things I think is missing, and it might be embedded somehow in the cultural systems here, is karyological time or chronological time. How we think about time itself isn't necessarily included in our graphics and our conceptual models and our discussions about vulnerability. And I mean we as social sciences. So one of the things I'm trying to do is figure out how does karyological time, or does karyological time, fit into social science conversations about vulnerability? How can this help us as a community, not only in maybe the operational community, but in the social science community, think differently about vulnerability? So that's my next step, is to think about what I'm working on with karyological time in relationship to the social sciences literature on vulnerability.
Okay, thank you for that additional explanation, Jennifer. We have a comment from Pat Spoden, and his comment is, we have been told that hospitals here in Paducah start working toward a warning situation when we have the conference call a day ahead of the situation. So basically, he is, you know, I believe, reinforcing your message is that understanding, you know, how the communications are interpreted by various core partners gets at this karyological time that paying attention to that can essentially assist them better to take the information we have to make better decisions.
Okay. Yeah. I think the webinars are, you know, one of the more popular, and you know, I'll correct me because you're in the forecast offices, but are one of the more popular pieces of information and mechanisms of information dissemination that people really like, because they're getting sort of firsthand. They can ask questions, they can ask about their unique areas and their situations. So yeah, that's probably one of the ones that we need to think about in terms of karyological time, when people need that sort of one-on-one or sort of group conversation allows Q&A, kind of the two-way discussion of the threat.
Thanks. So we're getting near the end of the time, but I did want to ask you, you know, stepping back, about you know, recommendations that you might have. I know this research is very preliminary, and you're just sort of rolling up your sleeves and learning a lot of stuff. But at this point, do you have any, other than continuing your research, of course, you know, thoughts that you could share with the National Weather Service about how we might better approach, you know, applying your concepts to delivering, you know, better IDSS?
Yeah, so such a great question, and I love that that you ask it, because I think it's important for social sciences to sort of try to answer some of these questions, as difficult as it may be, because we don't have the one answer. But one clear thing that came through in my research that I think could be, I don't know, implemented but acted on very quickly, is the conversations that happen between the SPC and the NWS. And I would include the WPC and the NWS. I don't know what IDSS looks like. Is there an IDSS model that helps the SPC understand their partners, which are the local FOs, and the local FOs understand the SPC in ways that can help avoid or restructure or rethink how information is timed and disseminated between national and local offices. I think we think of IDSS basically as being from the local FO out to partners. And it's often, it can still be unidirectional. We're trying to make it more bidirectional so that it's more of a conversation. But is IDSS actually happening internal to the Weather Service so that there's decision support services between national and local offices? There's almost no research that's been done to study the relationships between national offices, including the WPC and the local forecast office. And I think there are a lot of opportunities there to improve communications, to improve messaging, to improve understanding. That's something I think that could be looked at right away, and maybe have as kind of a conversation internally as to how to improve those sorts of understandings. And then I would guess, going out from the other end in terms of DSS, the other thing that's become apparent to me in this research with this particular case is how much the broadcast community is able to do some of that localized situational karyological time informed analysis of where their viewers are. Not all of them, but if you looked at the Facebook live streams for some of these broadcasters and saw the hundreds of questions that were coming in and how quickly broadcasters were trying to get information that was specific and contextual to people, you can see the real value in making sure that broadcasters are working really closely with the National Weather Service, so that there is that opportunity to extend the reach of kind of understanding your audience, understanding your customers. The Weather Service doesn't have that ability, nor should they necessarily have to do that, but broadcasters can do more of that. So I think that's a really close partnership that needs extra attention, I would say.
Very good response. I think right on point. We do recognize that we have organizational boundaries within the Weather Service that don't necessarily lend themselves to sort of smooth and seamless IDSS. So hitting on the SPC, WVC, WFO roles in that regard is certainly on point. And the same thing sort of applies with the broadcast community, where the users don't. It's all transparent to them, or like to be, how what they get their information, who they get their information from, and our relationship with the broadcast community could certainly benefit from improved collaboration and coordination. Again, because the important thing is how people respond and what's the best means to get them to respond the way we would like. So I certainly think that's very insightful on your part, and something we need to work on here in the agency. So, well, I think we're at the top of the hour here, and I know there are lots of other questions that people might have, but we're going to have to cut it off. I want to thank Jennifer Henderson again for this really great presentation, and to remind everyone that this recording will be uploaded to the VLabForum website. At the end, Jennifer's slides are already up there, so if you want to share the slides or the recording with your colleagues, please do so. And we will see you in February for our next session. And we hope to have some more IDSS-related talks in the future, and things that some of our colleagues in the social sciences are working on. So thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you so much.
Okay, signing off, everyone.